begin as more people file in. I just want to thank everyone for being here. It's been really a pleasure here at Time and Space in Hudson, New York. We've been doing these Zoom film clubs, and we're going to do more in the future. The event today is brought to you by TSL in Hudson and presented in collaboration with Upstate Films. We're really appreciative and thankful to Upstate for joining us today, and Jason Silverman, who's recently been named the co-executive director at Upstate, and who is the co-writer, director, producer of Sembene, and Samba Gadjigo, who is the Helen Gould Professor of French at Mount Holyoke College, and co-writer, director, producer of the feature documentary Sembene. So thank you, everyone. Jason and Samba, do you want to say a quick word, and we'll get right into discussing the film?
Yeah, Samba, I can start if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
I would say, first off, everyone doesn't mind muting themselves, and I think the best way to watch this would be if in your top right you can see a button. You can choose to view in speaker or gallery, and I think it would be best if you viewed it in speaker mode, and then you can see Samba up close as he describes the film. We're going to show some clips too, and we're really grateful to Kevin and the crew at Time and Space Limited, and just to say, please support your local art house theater. It's, they're an essential, part of American culture. I think these independent theaters are, people say we need something to confront this fake, the misinformation that's happening, the propaganda that's happening in the world. We need more, liberal or more conservative, broadcast entities. I think what we need is more artists' voices amplified. And I don't know if there's any collective that does that more effectively than Art House Cinemas in America and independent theaters. So please support your independent theater. I'm really grateful to be here today. And just a few notes about who Ousmane Sembène is. Some of you know this, of course. Sembène was born in Senegal in 1923. He was the son of a fisherman. He was kicked out of school in the 6th grade, and was a manual laborer from the time he was 14. Served in the French army during World War II and emigrated to Marseille in the late 1940s. And once there, he got deeply involved with labor unions and was radicalized politically by those unions, and saw the potential to be something more than, basically enslaved by the kind of work that immigrants, particularly immigrants of color, did in France at that time. So he joined the labor union, became a superstar there. When he broke his back in an accident, he was working as a dock worker. He began reading deeply in world literature, and was even more radicalized by that experience, and deeply moved by the stories he was encountering. They came from the Union Library, so they had a certain kind of, they had a progressive orientation and an ideology that was, about unity. And one thing he realized, though, is that there were no African stories being told, and particularly no stories being told about African working class people. And so this dock worker who was recuperating, laying on his stomach for months, recuperating from a broken back, decided he would be the person who would bring the stories of the African working class to the world. And it was this incredible, kind of arrogant but beautiful leap of faith, that resulted in what I think is one of the most remarkable works, collections of works of any artist of the past 100 years, let alone an African artist, let alone a self-educated artist. When Sembène returned to Africa after independence in 1960, he decided that the books he was writing, he became a successful novelist in France, were not enough. And so he decided to teach himself how to make movies. And he made his first short film in 1962, a fantastic film called Baram Charette. And Mandabi is his second feature film after Black Girl. And it was released at a really powerful time in Senegalese and West African history. And so that's a little bit about what we'll start with here with Samba, who's a little too young to remember 1969 in Dakar, but has a lot of insights into it. Just a quick note, Samba and I have been spending a lot of time on this project, on this film. We'll talk about this a little more, but we helped launch this restoration of Sembene's works with the Criterion Collection and others. And so, we're producers on this series of releases from Sembene, which will be streaming out over the next few years. So it's a really fun time for us to be talking about it. So great. Kevin, do you want to jump in, or should I just start with Samba?
Yeah, you can start. I'm also curious, how did you two meet? Was it through Sembene?
Well, I think that's a very interesting story in itself. I am a professor here at Mount Holyoke, so I'm a scholar. I was been writing and reading about Sembene, about African writers. But then it came a point where I also realized, mostly after Sembene died, that really writing books about Africa would not cut it, that I also, like Sembene, need another medium to kind of amplify that, what Jason was referring to, how to amplify those African voices. So in my walk through Sembene, Jason also here in the United States, in Santa Fe, certainly wanted to introduce, if you will, the voice of the voiceless here in American popular culture. So in his programming, he decided to introduce some African films. So in his research, of course, when you type African cinema, the first word that comes is Sembene, naturally. And then in doing that research, also he came under my name and asked me to he commissioned an article, and then we met. It has been, what, 14 years now, Jason, or more?
Feels like a lifetime.
Yeah, it has been a lifetime. So we really started doing those programming and him hosting me. And then at some point after Sembene died in 2007, I had accumulated boxes and boxes of research. I wanted to share those with the rest of the world, but I have a very limited technological knowledge or whatever major knowledge. So I just asked Jason very bluntly, what can we do? How can you help me to put this into a website? And he looks at me and said, no, not website, we are going to make a movie.
And
so that happened, and we fought, we cried, we fell, we did everything. We walked on our knees, and in 2015 the film came out. But I think the most interesting thing that came out of, that's what, if you ask me, is really this long-standing and productive friendship.
Well, we're grateful for the friendship. And for those who haven't seen the documentary, there's a great scene where Sembene gives you the keys to his house and says, come anytime, when you realize that he's actually making you the keeper of his legacy.
He was looking for a voice, an extension. I mean, he was already in his, I would say, mid-70s when we met. And of course, he was very, very conscious of his fragility as a human being and of his mortality. And he wanted a voice to continue that work he was doing. So I was very humbled by that experience. It's a very heavy weight, but a weight we are carrying now with Jason with a lot of pride.
Yeah.
To tell you the truth, yeah.
And one last thing before you guys begin, I thought it was really, speaking of the voice, being a voice to the voiceless, I didn't know, and I'm curious if people here listening today knew that actually you mentioned in the documentary that before independence, French authorities actually prevented African filmmaking.
Yes, I mean, that's also, history will retain that. I think there's still a lot to write about African cinema and the role that cinema played, because in the West, I mean, 1895 was in the heyday of colonization. And as such, of course, cinema participated in the ideology of colonization. Now, they also understood after, let's say, 1900, the first film were shown in Africa, they also understood the potential subversive nature of cinema. So why would we give this weapon to the natives? Why would we give this weapon to the subaltern? Because they could also portray us and them under a different light. So in 1935, there was a decree that was issued prohibiting Africans from picking a camera and telling their own stories.
I mean, it's worth mentioning too that the colonial project in everywhere, but in Africa particularly, was a project of, particularly with the French, was a project of occupying the indigenous population's minds as much as it was occupying the territory. So the effort to control education, news, culture, got even more attention than military occupation. So there's a phrase in a book called Ambiguous Adventure where they talk about conquering the Africans with the cannon, C-A-N-O-N, rather than the cannon, C-A-N-N-O-N. And so Sembene's work is in direct response to that as a reclamation process. The idea was to bury or swamp or destroy African cultures of all kinds and to supplant it with European cultures. And in so doing, have kind of endless domination of the area. So when Sembene started writing books in 1956 and we started making films in 1962, the object was to create a new African story, a new African story, a new African history.
Yeah. And based on the clear understanding, yes, Jason has said it, he has been an activist in Marseille against the war in Algeria, against the war in Indochina, against the war in Korea. But very, very early, maybe he was one of the first Africans to really do understand that more than physical direct political activism, that really storytelling would be the most enduring weapon, because colonization was built on stories that were told about Africa and Europe. So the best way to undo those relationships or to demystify the colonial enterprise and to come up with that African project was to tell African stories. And there are many political activists we have forgotten in Africa nowadays, but here we are in 2021 still talking about Sembene, so which demonstrate the power and the timelessness of storytelling.
And it's just worth saying one little anecdote about that is that when Senegal was formed, Sembene was approached to become a minister of the country. He was a minister of transportation or minister of something. He could have been a political leader en route to perhaps becoming president. And he said no to that. He wanted to be a storyteller. He thought the best way to kind of lift Africa up, to galvanize Africans, to liberate Africans after colonization was through storytelling, not through political. I mean, political action was how the stories would influence that. So he turned down the chance to become, a political leader.
Yeah.
Should we jump into Mandabi now, Kevin?
Yeah, let's jump in. And I'm curious, while you're talking just about the importance of language in the film, what has to be interpreted, what needs to be read, what's in French, what's in his native tongue. So just as that's kind of I'm curious about your take, Samba, about those things as you're talking about the film. But yeah, please jump in.
Yeah, I mean, Jason has already laid the ground. Sembene from 1956 to 1960 to Senegal's independence had written already 3 books, right? And intending on participating in nation building in Africa. Then 1960, he arrives and realizes that, oh my God, I'm doing these books in French while 85% of Africans cannot read and write in French. Thus, the search for a medium which would reconcile him with the African audience, but also reconcile him with traditional African storytelling by the griot. What could do better than cinema? So he turned to cinema in 1962. But his Borom Saret, if you see the voiceover in English or in French, when you take a Black Girl also, it is really with Mandabi that Sembene accomplished what I would say the biggest revolution in storytelling in Africa, meaning using African languages, Wolof, which of course influenced not only I experience, of course, movie theaters here in the United States. I also experience them in my classroom and experience them in Africa. When you are in a movie theater in Senegal and the film is made in Wolof, or when you are in Burkina Faso, the film is made in Jula, it's a total dynamic. You see how these filmmakers, by the simple use of an African language, completely change the relationship even between the storyteller and those who are listening. I mean, people would create really an evening village, where the movie theater being that evening village in which people are interacting. There is even interaction between the viewer and the characters in the film, meaning he managed by the use of African languages to bring back Africa to life. The viewers are not just passive viewers absorbing stories. It is their stories that are being told. These are stories they know and they participate in the telling of it. But again, Sembene used African languages. People say, yes, Sembene is a realist. Of course, he was influenced by the Soviet filmmaking, like using your camera to tell reality. But for Sembene, the role of an African artist is not just to tell reality, but to help in changing that reality. So he put the mirror in front of African people, using their own languages, galvanizing them to think about their situation, whether or not they want to change those situations. And I think Sembene is the first one to do that. In that sense, I think in the annals of world cinema, Mandabi played a very, very important and a unique role.
So yeah, so the story with Mandabi is that any films that were being made in West Africa were going to be funded by the French, and so Sembene got support from the French government. Andre Malraux, the Secretary of Culture, the Minister of Culture for France, and someone who Sembene was a hero to Sembene for his writing. Offered to pay for the film, but he wanted the film in French. Sembene wanted the film in Wolof, and so they shot two versions of it. Yeah. So maybe it's probably a good time to like jump into the film a little bit, Samba, and we can play some clips. We'll play some clips first, but I just want to set the scene a little bit because 1969 is 9 years after independence.
68, yeah.
68, okay, 8 years after independence, and independence was won through promises of, a kind of collective energy of progress for the working class, of African unity, of, escape from poverty, et cetera, et cetera. What was happening in 1968? Was there progress being made in Senegal?
Well, I think that's a very, very interesting question. In 1960, of course, many out of the 14 African colonies, maybe except Algeria, that did not get independence until 1962. In 1960, we each got our national anthem and our flag. And we are told that, of course, colonization is over. French officials have been replaced by Black African officials. Well, Sembene wanted to show using that film was to put the spotlight on a system. Yes, the people have changed, but the stem remained the same. What is that system? It is a colonial system in which people are even denied the most basic elements of their life, which is their own languages and their own culture. And at the same time, that those people are being completely alienated from their culture. There is a new class of individuals completely, if you will, brainwashed, groomed by the colonizers to continue exactly the same task, meaning a new not to use a big word, neo-colonial, if you will, or corrupt administration that is here to enforce the same rules, the same regulations put in place during the colonial time. So in that sense, the film is a macroscopic look at Senegal, of course, Senegal being here an example only of other French colonies, how a system that has been put in place, that has been said to have been disappeared, but was hidden under the rug with the same functioning, the same institution, the same language, and also the same regulations, to such a point that it is after independence that the Senegalese are even more exploited, more repressed, and more oppressed than during the colonial period. So in a very, very short way, that's what the film deals with. I mean, how independence, as we acquired it, has been a betrayal of the aspirations of the people.
Yeah, and so just to give a quick summary of the film for those of you who haven't seen it, a man is who's struggling to feed his family, who has his own sense of arrogance, but that's something we'll see in some of these clips. Receives a money order from his nephew who has emigrated to France, and the money order is intended to be held for the nephew's wedding when he returns to Senegal, and with a little bit to go to the family. And it's not for a lot of money. It's for 25,000 CFA. Is that right?
$50 today.
$50 today. But it's a life-altering, even the 10% of that, the $5 or 20% of the $10 is a life-altering prospect for this family. And so when the man goes to cash the money order, he's told he can't cash it because he doesn't have the proper ID. He goes to get the proper ID and he doesn't have a photo. He goes to get a photo and he's scammed. Finally, he calls in help and from a nephew, and the money order is stolen from him. And so he ends up with nothing except for more debt, because once the word gets out in the local community about him owning this, having this money order and having access to rice, everyone comes to him for handouts. And so every human relationship in this film is transactional. Everything is about getting money or getting rice, somehow surviving. Friends are only friends as long as you can help them survive this crisis, or so it's a very, in some ways, cynical film, and a cynical film that worked directly against the kind of story that the Senegalese government was telling its people about this world of progress and this beautiful urban area that was being constructed, and a socialist future, etc. So it was a very controversial film. At the time that it was released, there were actually protests building in Senegal by students. And Samba, you can tell us a little more about that as background.
Yeah, I think the release was very, very timely. Sembene certainly had calculated it. As you said, he released Black Girl in 1966 during the World Festival of Black Art in Senegal. Of course, as you said, André Malraux and Richard Wright, all these luminaries were there, which really put Sembene on world stage, of course, infused in him even more courage that he had. Now, he started making this film in 1967, and the release in 1968 coincided at a very, very turbulent moment in not only Senegal's history, but in French history. 1968 was the student protest at the Sorbonne in France, with the leadership of luminaries like Jean-Paul Sartre, the government of Charles de Gaulle, which was completely on brink, and then trade unions joined into contest. So like a tidal wave, that sense of revolution and rebellion of students and workers also arrived in West Africa. So in 1968, the University of Dakar was closed. Students were in the protest. Trade union leaders were arrested. So it is in the midst of all that turbulence that Mandabi was released. And of course, you can realize how the official press reacted to the film. And President Senghor actually who was then the living antithesis of Sembène, was in the movie theater. And when he came out of it, the next day, headlines in national newspaper, if Sembène wants to make revolution, he has to assume his responsibilities. But the same way the film was rejected by the political establishment, the same way it was embraced by students. As Jason talked about the restoration of the film, one of the components of the new DVD or Blu-ray is that we went back to Senegal and we interviewed the people who were students then in 1968, who saw the release of the film and who were also among the student activists. So I think the film came at a moment when Senegalese unions and the youth were looking for leadership, for an alternative. And Mandabi placed Sembène again as a leadership position, as an icon or African revolution. So in that sense, I think it has been a unique film in the history of African cinema.
Yeah. So let's watch a little clip. And this is, what I love about the film is that the way we're talking about it is at a political text, but it's actually quite lively just as a human drama. Sembène doesn't do things that are simplistic. So there's a lot of layers happening here. So we're going to watch an interesting clip now. Stand by here. So one of the things, you're laughing, and that's what I kind of want to talk about, that is that the comedy in that scene might not be apparent to everyone, and the kind of satire that's happening there. And, we see an abusive, hypocritical man, of course, who was sleeping right before, and then found then sleeping and was, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about how Senegalese audiences would have received that scene and the comedy and the satire and the dark satire in it?
Listen, the film starts, actually, we did not show that part. We know it is on a Friday. Senegal being 95% Islam, there could not be a more sacred day in Islam. That's when all the believers, you have to shave clean, you have to put on your best clothes, and you have to go to the mosque. Well, because this unemployed, whose household had not eaten in few days, had received just the hope that he has received the money order. They go borrow rice and oil and whatever, and they stuff themselves. And that very day, he was supposed to give an example and go to the mosque. He overate and overslept, which is already within Senegal, it's just unbelievable. How can a patriarch, really oversleep during the day of the mosque? But at the very time that he stuffed himself, cannot even breathe because he's burping, he's telling his wives, well, you guys, when your bellies are full, all you think about is, he's blaming them for the very thing he has been victim of. And the second, Ibrahim Adje, as I said, is a domestic tyrant. We'll discover later in the film, he is the most powerless. One of the tragedies of the film is that we discover that he is certainly one of the most powerless or rendered powerless by Senegalese independence and the Senegalese system. But at the same time, he is ruling his household with an iron fist. So I think it is a kind of decalage between those two that is at the same time laughable, but also very, very tragic. Sembène could have criticized the failed independence by showing maybe a working class who lost his job and so on and so forth. No, just puts his camera in a household running on a daily basis. Now, what is very, very interesting, the big transition in the film, this windfall, the money order, already we discovered that, yes, he hopes now on he's not going to go hungry. Yes, the amount is small for us, for him it is a bonanza, but he cannot even read the money order. He cannot even read that letter. We'll see later when he goes to the post office, even to have that letter translated from French to Wolof, he would have to pay. And then his ordeal starts. A transaction that should have taken, 10, 15 minutes, takes him days. He goes from, the administration is a maze of corruption, post office. You have to have an ID card. We don't know ID card. You have to have a photograph. We don't know photograph. You have to have a birth certificate. So finally, what Sembene is really showing that this guy who is at the same time a domestic oppressor, but also an oppressed within the system itself. And if you have seen the film, you know, at the end, he loses the money which is stolen by his own nephew. And which also really gives, this is a man who always believed in the virtue of honesty and doing well in the world. And once he falls victim of all this theft and all this corruption, toward the end of the film, his own take in his own society has already changed. I am going to be a hyena like everybody else. I'm going to be a crook like everybody else. So Sembene puts that judgment in the show, the psychological transformation of this man who was a good man and came to a point where he was falling prey to immorality, to theft, and so on and so forth. So I think that's what makes the film comical if you understand the cultural curtains into it, but also very, 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 very tragic. I mean, you laugh while you are crying in the fate of Ibrahim Ajay.
It gives us an opportunity to talk just a little bit about Sembene's attitude, at least in his films, not in his personal life, towards women. The personal life part is a little more complicated, so you'll have to wait till our biography is published for that part, and that would be another hour. But in his works, he has what was then a pretty radical understanding or a radical portrayal of women. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I think his position, well, yes, let's not talk about the biography, how women contributed in shaping his view, how he was educated by women and so on and so forth. But yes, I think being in Marseille and being a union organizer, working with African migrants, Sembene was able to witness firsthand the double jeopardy of women, not only as, well, migrants, Africans, Black, but also as women. And the influence was such that in his first novel, 1956, the first chapter of the first book is titled The Mother, Spotlight on Women. Then when you take his first feature film, Black Girl, of course, it is about women. And when you look at Sembene's latest film, it's about female genital mutilation. So I think women have always been an organizing element into Sembene's work. Two explanations that Sembene gave. First, it is a wink to the history of Africa, pre-colonial and pre-Islamic, in which many of the kingdoms, or if you will, were matriarchal political entities. It is Islam that made that shift from matriarchy to patriarchy. So Sembene is showing that if we restore the authenticity of African history, women were at the center of political, economic, and social life. Here is Islam, here is colonization that completely changed that. Second,
sorry.
Second,
I was going to say, yeah, sorry.
That's very pragmatic. By the time Sembene died in 2007, the continent had about close to 1 billion people. And of those 1 billion, more than 50% were women. And the Sembene theory is, do what you will, there will never be African development and African freedom when half of its humanity is subjugated by Islam, by Christianity, and by patriarchy. In sum, for Sembene, really the liberating force in Africa, it has to include women or it will never happen. Now, his relationship, personal relationship with women, that's another seminar, maybe for a semester.
That's more gossip. We have a great question from the audience about this clip. Can you talk about the significance of the white doll? And I know there's multiple layers to that.
There is multiple layers. I mean, what is Simone de Beauvoir, who is Jean-Paul Sartre's companion, wrote this seminal work on The Second Sex, in which she something like, one is not born a woman, one becomes a woman, meaning then education, society, and so on, narratives, whatever, make our gender roles, and so on and so forth. But those are taught through stories. Now we're at a junction where, because of colonization, we are no longer producing any new values. Normally, this doll, what is a doll? The doll is the first child of a woman, at least in that culture there, right? But here, since our artisans, our artistic production have been completely curtailed, our imagination have been completely curtailed, the only thing we have is that our creativity has been replaced with manufactured goods. Those manufactured goods, since they were manufactured in Europe, certainly there is more likely you are going to have a black doll without instead of a black doll. Now, Sembene is also echoing a poem that was written in 1960 by a young Senegalese poet, in which he talks about, give me back my black dolls, the black doll, which he equates with his origin, his sensibility, his culture, and his spirituality. So what Sembene is showing through that doll is that Senghor, our president, the same person who has sold us to the French, imposed on us French language, have also imposed on us French white values through the doll. But you can have multiple other explanations.
Just to reiterate what you just said, you're basically suggesting that in the past, a young girl like that would have been learning how to care for a child through a toy that she might have made with an elder, using local materials that was handcrafted, that she had some ownership of, and instead now she's got a mass-produced thing from Asia or Europe that has been probably passed down from, abandoned somehow. It's a commodity object.
I don't have to look very, very far. I never bought a toy during my childhood. We made our toys from raw material from the fields. Our soccer balls. What, you take a coconut, wrap it up with material. That was our soccer. I remember even making airplanes using stacks of hay. So we were creative. What somebody is saying, that creativity is completely gone. The same way that in the village, the leather worker made our shoes. Now the leather worker is dead because we import billions of pairs of shoes from China. So the same way also, what we used to consume, what we produced. Now we produce only what we import, and what we produce, we export. So actually, it's very interesting. The subtitle of the film is The Money Order. That order for Sembene, which is Mandabi, which is also a wink to the World Bank, Mandabi meaning that money order. Well, what Sembene is saying, Senegal and Africa have been introduced with colonization into a new economic, monetary, financial, and cultural order after the destruction of its own institutions and of its own values. You talked about it in the L'Aventure Ambiguë. You use weapons to subjugate the body, but you use values to subjugate the mind. So by being in front of this white doll, certainly this young girl is being fed with aspirations which are going to lead her far away, far afield from her own social values.
Beautiful, beautiful. I'm going to play another clip. We'll probably, let's see if we can get through 2 more clips because they're wonderful. So stand by. This one's a little bit longer. I might cut it off before intended place, just because we'll have a little more time for questions and talk. So this is in the middle of the film. See if you can recognize the man who's reading the letter here. Now, there's so many things that are remarkable about that to me. I mean, first of all, that voice, that's Sembene, isn't it, who's doing the voiceover?
It is Sembene, who is a public reader, yes.
He's the public reader, and he also performs the voice, right? Of the.
He also performed the voice, and to put it in our context, he's calling for immigration reform. No, I'm kidding.
Well, I mean, this is a long time before people were talking about immigration, but he himself was an immigrant. He can understand Abdu's situation as well as anybody. I mean, he left home, he couldn't find work, and he went to France, and he found basically what was slave labor on the docks.
Yes, and actually it's very, very interesting. Yes, 6 years after independence, Paris is still the center of our lives, and we are the periphery, certainly. And certainly Sembène having been a migrant worker in Marseille, I mean, on whose back the Marshall Plan was implemented. And Abdu is a second generation. We clean the subways, we clean the streets, and then we get some handout, and it is those handout that help to sustain Africa. I mean, I think Abdu's letter summarizes the whole economic situation of Senegal. We know Jean has stayed years without working, and that unemployment is rampant. There are no development plans and so on. So all our able-bodied, not only actually manual workers, intellectual, artists. I mean, when Sembene was making this film, you could not make a film, you could not write a book, you cannot release a dance without going to Paris. So Paris remained the center of this former colonial empire, which attracts all the energies into it.
And that hasn't changed much, has it?
It got worse now, if you ask me. I mean, there are new films that got produced recently. Certainly, I don't know if you, Les Miserables, which is of course inspired by Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. This is a young Malian French who made this film about the hot neighborhoods in migrant neighborhoods in France. Algerians, Moroccans, Tunisians, Senegalese, Nigerians, and so on and so forth. So the situation has actually it got worse in the 80s with the International Monetary Fund policies in Africa, which ushered in more poverty, destruction of public service, public education, public health. So you see more, I mean, you're also aware of all these quote unquote boat people. You have hundreds of thousands of young Africans who jump in makeshift boats right now from Libya to Morocco to try to cross the Mediterranean and then to go to Lampedusa Island in Italy. So we're talking about a film that was made in 1968 that still speaks to the African situation today. So not only Sembène described the reality, but also he's a visionary. All the problems we are faced now are already packed in that film.
And just a word about resource extraction, perhaps.
Yes, it is estimated that 80% of all businesses in French-speaking Africa are owned by the French. You have, of course, the biggest is a gas company. I think it's Total, right, which owns Senegal. All of our peanut farming was imposed on us by French. All the production of peanuts in Senegal is processed in Bordeaux and Marseille in soap factories and oil factories. All our phosphate, which is extracted in Senegal, it also transferred to France. So today, I think if France is arguably one of the most important, economically important nations on earth, that has not happened by miracle. It has happened by well-designed relationship between France and its former colonies. One case in point, in 1945, Charles de Gaulle introduced a currency that was specifically designed for French colonies in Africa, called CFA, Communauté Financière de l'Afrique. Today, what is the debate in Africa? Whether or not we should abandon that currency. And the horrible thing is that the currency, meaning all the international transactions of 14 countries in Africa, are controlled by the Bank of France today, as I speak.
Amazing. Amazing. And the human capital too. I mean, of course we know about slavery, but Abdu is a young man who should be contributing locally to his, he should be a business owner or an educator or a professional, or, and starting his family in Dakar or in his village. And instead, it's remittances. I mean, the remittance business is, supplants the idea of building a culture from within.
Studies from Western Union, which is maybe arguably one of the biggest money transfers in the world, have estimated that Senegal, that remittances constitute 30% of Senegal GDP. Meaning, if I were not here in South Hadley, 20 people would have died in my village, because every month you have to send the money to buy rice, basic education, health, and so on and so on and so forth. So it is all that system. We really, when Sembène said the money order, I mean, he is such foresight. This was in the 60s. He already predicting, in light of our 60s reality, what is going to happen in the future with the International Monetary Fund, with the World Bank. Abdou in Paris, what is he? He's just a broom. Does not have any individuality, that is not integrated into French society, does not speak French, cannot, I'm sure that letter he wrote, someone wrote it for him. Now, he's well exploited even through the French language. For us to communicate with each other, we have to use that language, and to do so, it costs us money. So everything is designed to exploit the colonies under, of course, the disguise of bringing civilization, bringing enlightenment, bringing culture. And I'll stop there by just echoing what Hegel, the German philosopher, was already talking about in, I think, in the 19th century. As far as historical movement is concerned, Africa is a cold continent, meaning our progress will rest on the shoulders of the white man, who is who's supposed to bring light in the heart of darkness.
Great. Powerful. So let's watch one more clip, because we're getting close to the end here. And then we will do a quick round of questions. We'll probably be running out of time pretty soon, but this is a really powerful clip, and there's a little bit of hope at the end. So it's an interesting one. There's so much happening just in those like 2.5 minutes. It's really incredible.
It is not just an indictment of the colonial system, Jason. Nobody can explain to you the power of this scene unless you are really very knowledgeable of Senegalese culture. So drama is a tragedy, is not that the money order got stolen, but stolen by his nephew. When you know the meaning of nephew, uncle, or auntie relationship within Senegalese culture, what Mbai did, Mbai, who is the nephew, is worse than incest. It is in our folklore, in our belief system. The nephew, of course, is a legacy of our matrilineal systems. In traditional Senegal, for instance, inheritance, political or social, was not made from the paternal line, but from the maternal line. Like if you were a king, it is not your son, it is not Theo who would have inherited the chair. It would have been your nephew, meaning your sister's son. And it also believed that in our folklore, we are told that in the day the world is over and we are all lined up to be judged by the Lord, you would pass your father would not look at you. You would pass your mother would not look at you. But when you get close to your uncle, he'll come and embrace you. It is a tearing apart of those cementing values, the very core of our existence as people. that got torn apart by money. It's just so profound. It's sad to a point that, as I said earlier, Jeng, yes, completely ignorant, but very, very deep believer on those traditional thoughts, to come to a point where he loses hope. Everything is gone. Even my nephew stole from me. And I think that's when Sembene's camera also does something fantastic. Against despair, he restores hope that there is always a possibility that the people can bring in change. But I mean, this scene is maybe the strongest indictment of Senegalese society and what the combined forces of obscurantist forces of Islam and the colonization has contributed in tearing our social fabric.
Amazing. Powerful, powerful, powerful. So, you know, if you guys have, we can open this up. I think there's a few questions before we wrap up. Kevin, are we in good shape to head towards a wrap?
I think we're in a good place for a finale, and I can begin by asking a question of my own.
Okay, yeah.
Well, I mean, it's, you know, I think just this kind of theme of throughout the film of his livelihood being blocked by administrative details, right? And the money is never a tangible thing in the movie, but this idea, and it's not only money that the family lacks, but the language to secure it. And that's why I was so curious about language as a whole in terms of, you know, asking you that in the beginning. But anyway, so I'm just curious for the audience about an image from your documentary, Sembene. And I don't know, Jeff, my coworker, is downstairs manning the shot, but he mentioned something to me about this powerful image of seeing Sembene with someone like Spike Lee or Bill Greaves, and just what he has meant to, you know, contemporary filmmaking and sort of radical filmmaking in the US for the past 30, 40 years. And I'm also curious about your take on the future of African filmmaking.
Well, when it comes to the radical arts culture here in the United States, I mean, Jason and I, we did not include in the documentary, but we had the opportunity to interview Angela Davis. Was it at Cornell, Jason? At Cornell University when we were preparing for the film. Basically, she was saying in the Black student movement activist here, I'm not saying it would not have happened without Sembene, but Sembene's work played a very, very important role. Mostly Black girl. She said she not only has read it, but also she teaches it and it also inspires it. Now, when he talks to, and I was not there when Spike Lee went there, but I was there when John Singleton went to visit Sembene. So certainly he has created this kind of dialogue. He has been this inspiration for many Black and progressive American filmmakers and writers, cultural activists, photographers, and so on and so forth. But he has also made connection with filmmakers in Latin America, in South America, mostly I visited Brazil and I found his pictures with Gravo Rocha and all these revolutionary filmmakers. Then of course, Jason and I dub him as the father of African cinema. Yes, he's not the first to pick up the camera, but if we are talking today about the standards, the characteristics of African cinema, it's Sembene who laid the ground. Now, even today, we just showed here a few years ago at Mount Holyoke a documentary film by a young Senegalese woman filmmaker. The title is "The Revolution Want to Be Televised." I mean, there is no argument of Ousmane Sembene's vision and legacy into that filmmaking. Jason?
Well, there's this great scene in your documentary where he says, you know, we should not be Europe's eternal guests. And, you know, in reference to, I think he was invited to be a juror at Cannes. And, but he talks about how important it is to create his own, or as Senegal and Africa, as a continent's own values, recognize them and carry them throughout the world. And
Yeah.
just a note, I was lucky enough to see Maddie Diop speak.
Mati Diop, yes,
And
yes.
she said, she was raised in France, and she obviously she's half Senegalese, and she said that there was a darkness in her life being this Senegalese half of her, and so she, I think it was really important. And her film Atlantics, which came out last year, is an amazing film. That she embraced this side of her, went back to Dakar, and I think she's still living there now.
Yeah, I mean, her father, Jibril Diop Mambeti, is certainly one of the most noted African filmmakers, second generation after Sembène, and her father, Wassis Diop, won more music film awards in Africa than any other artist. So she's really in the thick of it. Of course, she grew up in France, but her film Atlantic was made in Senegal. So again, there you can see a certain legacy, how Ousmane Sembène influenced and continue to influence a lot of young African filmmakers.
So, are there any questions?
I see one from the audience from Francis, who's asking about Sembene's casting, which is actually a really good question.
Go ahead, Jason. Take it.
Well, part of the thing was there was no training there was no films being made, so there was actually no one to draw from professionally. Anyone who was going to pick up a camera or work as a grip or do anything had to be trained to do that. I mean, there was a few people who knew how to do that, who had gone to film school in Dakar. Sembène worked with them. And likewise, there were no trained film actors. There were actors who act on the stage, but that was kind of the opposite of what Sembène was looking for. And so over time, he had to build a group of people who he thought could carry these roles. And a lot of times they'd work with him on multiple films. And, I think the idea was to get, it's kind of the neorealist approach, where you try to get people who really embody the characters rather than people who can act like the characters.
Well, he was asked once, Sembène, why don't you use professional actors? And of course, a kick into Hollywood. He goes, if you ask me, professional actors are good only at two things: playing dead kings and gangsters. That you cannot take a professionally trained urban city girl, ask her to play the African peasant woman. So if you want to render their real life, they are not even acting, they are acting their own lives. Go to the bush and train them. So that's what he did. He always opposed this idea of a stardom of professional actors, household names who become superstars. He always opposed that.
And he would more or less he would use the characters' names, not the actors' names when he was on set.
Well, if he had lived to make his last project, the Brotherhood of Rats, I would have played into it, because he was already asking me if I wanted to play in one of his films, but that one never materialized, thanks God.
Well, Samba and Jason, thank you so much. I think everyone who was able to listen today is eternally grateful for your insight. That was truly amazing. I really recommend watching your documentary for those who haven't seen it. And of course, we're looking forward to seeing what films are restored in the future. Linda, would you like to make a note? Finally?
Yeah, I just want to, speaking from the TSL part of this program, we're eternally grateful for this wonderful conversation, Samba and Jason, and really totally informative and exciting to hear all the information that you brought to the table today. TSL is doing another event coming on March 20th. We're heading to the literary section of our space here. We're going to be doing To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, a discussion about that book. As a feminist, I must say Sembene is one of my all-time favorite filmmakers, and certainly brought a lot of light to our screen here in Hudson, New York. where we've been showing him for many, many years. So it's a pleasure to meet our neighbor out there in Holyoke, Mount
Thank you.
Holyoke. Those students are extremely lucky.
Thank
And I
you.
hope you'll visit us here in Hudson. And thanks again, Jason, and welcome to the neighborhood. And want to thank Kevin Gilligan and Jeff, who makes this all happen, and Claudia Bruce, the co-director of Time and Space Limited. That's it for me.
Thank you. I've pasted links to where you can watch our documentary into the chat. If you guys want, we could go out with the trailer. If a lot of you have seen this film, I think, but the documentary. But we could, Kevin, if that's cool, we could go out in the trailer. I've got it queued up here.
Let's do it.
All right.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity, folks. Hope to see
Thank
you
you.
soon.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Stand by. Oh, I lost it. Give me 1 sec. I'll pull it back up.
Jason, you're going to have to do an audio summation of the trailer.
No, we've got it here.
Some say we're made of flesh and blood. I believe we're made of stories. So, let me tell you a story of the dock worker who taught himself how to make movies and invented a cinema for a new Africa. Who used his camera to fight corruption and injustice and imagine a better world. Let me tell you the story of the father of African cinema, who used his camera as a weapon and gave us our stories back. I will tell you the true story of Sembene. I will not let his story be forgotten.